When the war ended, what it left behind followed him home. In sleepless nights, in a body that never fully healed, in a silence heavier than gunfire. Life kept taking things away until there was almost nothing left. Mike Sullivan stood at the edge of the property while a German shepherd stayed close at his side. With his last savings, he moved into an abandoned gangster mansion no one wanted, a place people avoided, a place where rumors stayed sealed inside the walls. The house was cold, the floors sagged. The past was supposed to stay buried. At night, he tried to ignore the sounds beneath the floor. His dog didn't, and when the dog found what had been hidden for decades, the truth came back into the light, and nothing after that stayed the same. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Cold wind moved through the bare trees as late autumn settled over the hills, carrying the smell of damp earth and rusted iron toward a mansion no one had touched in decades. Mike Sullivan parked his battered pickup at the edge of the property and sat still for a long moment before turning off the engine. He was 49, tall but worn down, his frame lean from years of service and months of poor meals. His shoulders carried a permanent stiffness, as if they never quite lowered after the war. A short, uneven beard shadowed his jaw, streaked with gray that had arrived earlier than it should have. His eyes were a dull blue, watchful and tired, the kind that rarely rested even when nothing was happening. The war had ended, but it lived on in his body and mind, through the ache in his knees, the ringing silence in his ears, and the constant sense that something was always about to go wrong. Beside him, Buddy shifted in the passenger seat. The German shepherd was 6 years old, large and solid, with a broad chest and powerful legs built for long distances. His fur was dark along the back, lighter around the face and chest, already showing hints of gray. Buddy's ears stood alert even when he was calm, and his amber eyes tracked the world with quiet intelligence. He had been trained once, commands, signals, discipline, but what defined him now was loyalty. He stayed close to Mike, not out of habit, but choice. Wherever Mike stopped, Buddy stopped too, settling only after he was sure his human wasn't going anywhere. The mansion rose ahead of them, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and iron gates bent inward like broken ribs. It was a massive stone structure from another era, its windows clouded with grime, its roof sagging under years of neglect. People in town called it cursed. They said it had belonged to a Prohibition-era gangster, that deals had been made inside its walls, and bodies buried where no one would look. Mike had heard the rumors when he signed the auction papers at a government office 2 counties away. The clerk, a thin man with pale skin and nervous hands, had raised an eyebrow and asked if Mike knew what he was buying. Mike had nodded. Knowing didn't matter. Having somewhere to go did. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel and dead leaves. The cold cut through his jacket immediately, settling into his joints. Buddy jumped down after him and circled once, nose low, taking in the unfamiliar scents. Mike watched the dog move, steady and deliberate, and felt a strange comfort in that simple motion. Too many things in his life had vanished without warning. His job at the warehouse after a back injury, the rented room when the landlord sold the building, the handful of people who had drifted away when he stopped pretending he was fine. Buddy had stayed. Inside the mansion, the air was stale and sharp with dust. Mike pushed the door open with effort, the hinges protesting loudly. The sound echoed through the vast entryway, then faded into silence. The floors were uneven beneath his boots, warped by moisture and time. He moved slowly, habit ingrained from years of checking corners and doorways, though he knew no one was waiting for him here. Still, his muscles didn't forget. Buddy followed close behind, nails clicking softly against the wood, his body relaxed but attentive. Mike dropped his duffel near the wall and stood there, breathing. This place wasn't welcoming. It wasn't warm. But it was his, He had signed the papers, handed over the last of his savings, and walked away with a key heavy enough to feel like a promise or a warning, depending on the day. He told himself he didn't expect miracles here. He wasn't looking to fix his life. He just needed shelter, a roof, 4 walls where no one would tell him to move along. As evening settled in, the mansion grew colder. Mike found a single room where the windows weren't completely shattered and set about making it usable. He worked methodically, clearing debris, stacking broken furniture out of the way. His movements were careful, conserving energy the way he'd learned to do when resources were limited. Buddy stayed nearby, occasionally resting but never fully sleeping. Every so often, the dog's ears twitched toward the deeper parts of the house, where shadows pooled and hallways disappeared into darkness. Mike noticed it but said nothing. He wasn't ready to think about what this place might hold beyond empty rooms and bad memories. Right now, survival was enough. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, exhaustion settling over him like a weight. The mansion creaked softly around them, the sound of old wood adjusting to the night. Mike closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest them for a moment, and felt Buddy's solid presence at his side. Whatever this place was, whatever it had been, it was where they would start again, not because it was safe or hopeful, but because it was the only place left that hadn't turned them away.
The days inside the mansion moved slowly, measured not by clocks, but by what Mike could fix before his body gave out. He woke each morning stiff and cold, joints aching from the night before, breath fogging in the unheated rooms. The roof leaked in 2 places, and when rain came, it drummed steadily into buckets he'd scavenged from the basement. Mike patched what he could with tarps and old boards, his movements careful and economical, shaped by years of learning how to work through pain without letting it show. He spoke little, even to Buddy, saving his energy for the essentials: fire, food, shelter. Money was already running thin. Mike drove into town every few days, parking at the edge of the lot near a small discount grocery, choosing items by weight and price rather than taste. Canned soup, bread nearing its expiration date, a cheap bag of kibble that Buddy accepted without complaint. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and dyed blonde hair, pulled into a loose bun, barely looked up when Mike paid in small bills. That suited him fine. He had learned that being invisible was often easier than being pitied. Nights were worse. Darkness settled heavily over the mansion, filling its long hallways and unused rooms. The fire in the small hearth Mike had cleared barely took the edge off the cold. He lay on a thin mattress he'd dragged into a corner room, staring up at a ceiling stained with old watermarks. Sleep came in short fragments, broken by sudden waking and the familiar tension in his chest. Each time he stirred, Buddy was already alert, ears forward, body angled toward the deeper parts of the house. It started with sound so faint, Mike wasn't sure it was real. A dull clink beneath the floor, followed by a soft dragging noise that seemed to travel rather than repeat. Mike held his breath, listening. His pulse quickened, then slowed as he forced himself to breathe evenly. Old houses made noise, he told himself. Wood shifted, pipes rattled. Animals found their way into places they didn't belong. He'd heard worse in his own head during the years after the war. Buddy didn't share his reasoning. The dog rose quietly, muscles tensing beneath his coat, a low rumble building in his chest. He planted himself near the doorway that led toward the basement stairs, refusing to move even when Mike called him back. Mike watched the dog for a long moment, irritation and unease mixing in his gut. Buddy had always been sensitive to his moods, quick to react when Mike's tension spiked. This, Mike decided, was that same reflex, nothing more. He reached for the orange pill bottle on the floor beside the mattress, the label worn and peeling. The medication dulled the edge of his thoughts, slowed the racing images that crept in when he was overtired. He swallowed one dry and lay back, staring into the dark. Buddy stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the unseen space beyond the door. The house creaked softly, settling into the night, and eventually the silence returned. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Daytime exhaustion, nighttime vigilance, sounds that came and went without warning. Mike began to anticipate them, even as he denied their importance. Each time he considered investigating, a familiar resistance rose in him, heavy and insistent. He had learned the cost of curiosity in other places, other times. Opening doors had consequences. Some things, once seen, could not be put away again. Buddy's behavior changed subtly. He paced more often after sunset, nose close to the floor, tail held low, but steady. He refused to eat when the sounds returned, standing instead with his body angled protectively between Mike and the basement entrance. Mike noticed, and with each passing night, the tension between what he felt and what he told himself grew harder to ignore. One night, after a particularly sharp metallic scrape echoed faintly from below, Mike sat up abruptly, heart pounding. His hand went instinctively to the empty space beside the mattress where a weapon would have been once. He exhaled slowly, anger flaring at himself. This wasn't the desert. This wasn't a combat zone. It was an abandoned house and an exhausted man who needed sleep. He lay back down, turning his face toward the wall, and forced his eyes closed. Buddy did not move. The dog remained standing long after the house fell silent again, watching the dark as if it might blink first.
Winter tightened its grip faster than Mike had expected. The cold seeped through the mansion's stone walls and settled deep into his bones, turning each morning into a slow negotiation between pain and necessity. One night, after the wind pushed snow through a crack in the east wall, Mike made a decision he had been putting off. If he didn't stop the drafts, neither he nor Buddy would make it through the season. He worked with stiff hands, prying away rotted paneling and pulling down warped boards. Each movement sent a dull ache through his shoulders, but he kept going, jaw set, breath controlled. Buddy stayed close, lying near the doorway, his head lifting every time a board hit the floor. When Mike finally broke through the inner layer of the wall, his tool struck something solid that wasn't stone or beam. The sound was different, hollow, deliberate. He froze, listening to the echo fade. Behind the last panel was a narrow wooden door, its edges carefully blended into the wall. The handle was old, tarnished brass, cool to the touch. Mike hesitated. His first instinct was to leave it alone. Doors like this rarely led to anything good. But the cold pushed at his back, and desperation had a way of lowering caution. He pulled it open. The room beyond was small but intact, sealed off from the rest of the mansion for decades. Dust coated everything in a fine, undisturbed layer. Inside were crates, a heavy desk, shelves stacked with ledgers, and objects wrapped in yellowed cloth. The air smelled stale, like paper and old metal. Buddy stepped in behind him, ears forward, nose working slowly. The dog did not growl. That alone unsettled Mike more than noise would have. He didn't touch much at first. He scanned the space, taking inventory the way he'd learned to do under pressure. Furniture, records, personal items. Nothing glittered. No obvious fortune waiting to be claimed. Just remnants of another life, another purpose. He found old documents stamped with dates from the 1930s and 1940s, names written in careful, slanted ink. Mike didn't read closely. He wasn't ready for that. Right now, the room represented warmth, wood he could burn, items he could sell. Money ran out 2 days later. Buddy's cough had worsened in the cold, and Mike needed medicine. He packed a few smaller objects from the hidden room into a crate and drove into town. The antique shop sat between a closed hardware store and a faded diner. Inside, the air smelled of polish and old fabric. The owner, a man named Frank Dalton, looked up from behind the counter. Frank was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but soft around the middle, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and tired brown eyes. His flannel shirt was clean but worn thin at the elbows. He spoke carefully, as if every word had weight. When Mike set the items on the counter, Frank examined them slowly, his expression unreadable. "These are old," Frank said finally. "Somebody kept them hidden on purpose." Mike shrugged. "I don't need history, I need cash." Frank nodded, as if he understood more than Mike had said. He named a price that felt low, but fair enough to keep Buddy fed and medicated for a few weeks. Mike accepted without bargaining. He didn't notice Frank pause over one particular object, a slim, leather-bound book tucked among the others, before setting it aside. Back at the mansion, Mike used the money carefully. Medicine first, food second. He burned scraps of broken furniture from the hidden room to keep the cold at bay. At night, he sat by the fire, exhaustion weighing heavier than curiosity. He avoided the sealed room, telling himself he'd deal with it later, when he had the strength. But something had shifted. Buddy lingered near the wall where the door was hidden, lying there even when Mike called him away. Mike felt it too, a subtle tension, a sense that he had disturbed something that didn't appreciate being uncovered. He pushed the thought aside. Survival came before understanding. As snow piled higher outside, Mike didn't know that one of the items he had sold carried more than dust and age. He didn't know it held a thread connecting the mansion's past to his own bloodline. All he knew was that for now, the fire was burning, Buddy was breathing easier, and the night could be endured one more time. The hidden room no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a responsibility Mike hadn't asked for. On a gray afternoon, when the snow outside softened into sleet, he finally returned to the sealed space and began reading what he had avoided. The ledgers were heavy in his hands, their pages brittle and stained, names and transactions recorded with careful precision. Mike read slowly, jaw tightening as fragments began to connect. Familiar locations, dates that matched stories he half remembered, a surname that stopped him cold, Sullivan, written once, then again, always followed by annotations that suggested debts, meetings, warnings. His father had always been spoken of as a quiet man, gone too soon. An accident, they said. A drunk driver. A clean story, easy to accept, easier to forget. But the documents in front of Mike told a different version. They hinted at a man who had brushed against the edges of the mansion's criminal world, who had tried to leave it behind and failed. Mike felt the room tighten around him as the truth settled in. The house wasn't random. Neither was his presence here. He pushed the papers away, palms flat on the desk, breathing through the familiar pressure in his chest. Anger rose first, at the lie, at the years of silence. Then something colder followed. Recognition. This was the same weight he'd carried since the war, the sense that some debts were inherited, whether you wanted them or not. The signs that he wasn't alone began subtly. A missed call from an unknown number that left no message. Tire tracks near the gate that hadn't been there the day before. Once, while hauling firewood from the shed, Mike caught movement at the tree line, a shape that disappeared the moment he focused on it. He told himself it was nothing. He had trained himself for years to doubt his own instincts when they flared too quickly. Buddy did not doubt. The German shepherd grew sharper, his posture rigid whenever Mike stepped outside after dark. His ears tracked sounds Mike couldn't hear, his body positioning itself instinctively between Mike and the open grounds. The dog's limp from the cold had improved with medicine, but his vigilance had intensified. Mike noticed how Buddy scanned the perimeter before settling, how he refused to stray far from the house. The calls continued, short, silent. Once, when Mike answered, all he heard was breathing before the line went dead. The old fear crept back in, the kind that had taught him to sleep light and move quietly. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. The intrusion happened on a night when the wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake loose flakes of old paint. Mike had just finished securing the doors when Buddy stiffened, a low growl vibrating through his chest. Before Mike could react, the dog bolted toward the back of the property. Mike followed, heart pounding, boots slipping on ice. A figure moved near the shed, tall and bundled in dark clothing. Mike didn't see a face, only the flash of motion as Buddy lunged. There was a sharp shout, the sound of impact, then retreating footsteps crunching through snow. Buddy yelped once and skidded to a stop, favoring his front leg. Mike dropped to his knees beside him, hands shaking as he checked for damage. The wound was shallow, a scrape more than a gash, but blood stained the fur. Rage and fear twisted together in his gut. Whoever had come hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected the dog. He carried Buddy inside, cleaned the wound as best he could, and stayed awake the rest of the night with his back to the wall and the fire poker within reach. The mansion felt different now, less abandoned, more observed. The silence pressed closer, not empty anymore, but watchful. By morning, there was no sign of the intruder beyond disturbed snow and the certainty that speculation was no longer enough. Mike looked down at Buddy, who lay resting but alert, eyes never fully closing. The truth had surfaced, and with it, attention. The past had found him, and it wasn't interested in staying quiet. The decision to leave came quietly, without drama, the way most breaking points do. Mike didn't announce it to the house or argue with himself about it. He simply moved. He folded the few clothes he owned with careful precision and packed them into the duffel. He gathered documents from the hidden room, selecting only what he thought might matter later, then hesitated and put most of them back. The mansion had drawn attention. Staying felt reckless. Leaving felt necessary. Outside, the night air was sharp enough to burn. Frost coated the ground, crunching beneath Mike's boots as he carried the bag to the truck. His breath came in steady clouds. He moved on habit, shutting doors, checking locks he knew wouldn't keep anyone determined enough out. The engine turned over reluctantly before catching. The sound felt too loud in the stillness. Buddy watched from the porch, body square and unmoving. His fur was still damp where Mike had cleaned the wound earlier, the scrape on his leg healing but tender. The German shepherd's posture was firm, ears forward, gaze locked on the darkness beyond the yard rather than on the truck. When Mike called him, Buddy didn't respond. Mike tried again, sharper this time. Buddy turned his head slightly, acknowledging the sound, but did not move. The dog stepped down one stair and then stopped, planting himself at the threshold as if the ground itself had told him where to stand. Mike felt irritation flare, followed by something closer to fear. He walked back toward the house, voice low, coaxing. Buddy's tail stayed still. "You're coming," Mike said, more to convince himself than the dog. Buddy finally looked at him, not with confusion or defiance, but with certainty. The dog's eyes reflected the porch light, calm and steady. He was not refusing out of stubbornness, he was choosing. Mike stood there longer than he realized, the cold creeping through his jacket. His mind replayed old instincts: withdraw, relocate, survive. It was what he had done after the war, what he had done when jobs ended and doors closed. He left before things could collapse. It had kept him alive. It had also kept him alone. A flicker of movement near the tree line caught his attention. Nothing clear enough to identify, just a shift of shadow. His muscles tightened. This was why he was leaving. This was the smart choice. He could disappear again, find another place where no one knew his name or his history. He looked back at Buddy, still planted at the threshold, guarding something Mike couldn't yet define. The dog had charged a stranger without hesitation. He had bled without retreating. He had sensed danger long before Mike was willing to accept it, and now he was refusing to abandon the house. Mike shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise. He leaned against the truck, eyes closed, and felt the familiar weight of fear press in. It wasn't the fear of violence. It was the fear of staying, of facing something instead of outrunning it. He thought of his father, of the half-truths that had shaped his life. He thought of the hidden room and the way the documents had waited, untouched, as if expecting him. He thought of how every time he ran, the past followed anyway, reshaping itself in new forms. Mike opened his eyes and looked at the mansion again. It was battered and unwelcoming, its windows dark, its walls scarred, but it hadn't turned him away. It had simply existed, holding what it held, indifferent to his fear. He walked back to Buddy and knelt, resting a hand against the dog's broad chest. Buddy leaned into the touch, tension easing just enough to be felt. Mike exhaled slowly. "All right," he said quietly. He unpacked the truck without ceremony, carrying the duffel back inside. The house creaked around them, as if acknowledging the decision. Mike locked the door behind him, not because it would stop anyone, but because the act mattered. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel like a trespasser waiting to be chased off. That night, Mike didn't sleep much, but he didn't leave either. He sat by the fire with Buddy at his side, listening to the wind move through the trees. The danger hadn't passed. Nothing was solved. But for the first time in a long while, Mike wasn't running. The decision to speak did not come all at once. Mike spent several days weighing each document in his hands, reading the margins again, tracing the names until they stopped feeling abstract. He knew enough now to understand the danger of silence. The past thrived in darkness, and this house had been built to keep secrets intact. One morning, with Buddy lying at his feet, Mike made 2 calls from the old landline he had managed to get working. The first was to an independent journalist. The second was to a veterans outreach organization whose number he had carried in his wallet for years without ever using. The journalist arrived 2 days later. Her name was Claire Donnelly, a woman in her early 40s with sharp green eyes and a posture that suggested she was always braced for resistance. She wore a weathered coat and carried a notebook with frayed edges, the kind used by someone who preferred facts over spectacle. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, streaked with gray that didn't bother her. Claire listened more than she spoke, nodding occasionally as Mike laid out what he knew. She didn't promise headlines or exposure. She promised accuracy. That was enough. The representative from the veterans organization came the following morning. Thomas Reed was a tall man with a calm, steady presence, his broad shoulders and trimmed beard marking him as someone who had worn a uniform once. A faint limp suggested an injury that had never fully healed. He spoke carefully, choosing words that didn't push. When Mike handed over the remaining documents, only copies, never originals, Thomas didn't rush to examine them. He asked Mike how long he'd been alone. The question landed harder than any legal warning. The truth came out slowly. Enough was released to make the mansion impossible to ignore, but not enough to turn it into a spectacle. Claire published a restrained piece outlining the house's history, its ties to organized crime, and the unanswered questions that remained. No names were sensationalized. No accusations went further than the evidence allowed. It was just enough light to prevent the past from being buried again. Within weeks, the property was quietly placed under legal protection, its ownership verified, its status clarified. The attention faded as quickly as it had arrived. Mike didn't become wealthy. There were no hidden fortunes waiting to be claimed, no sudden reversal of his circumstances. What changed instead was simpler. The mansion stopped feeling like a trap and began to feel like a structure with purpose. Thomas returned with supplies, blankets, heaters, basic medical kits. He asked if Mike would be willing to help other veterans passing through the area. Not a program, not a shelter, just a place to get through the night. The first man arrived during a snowstorm. His name was Alan Mercer, thin and stooped, with hollow cheeks and hands that shook from the cold. He was quiet, polite to a fault, and moved as if expecting to be told to leave at any moment. Mike showed him where to sleep, handed him a bowl of soup, and said nothing else. That seemed to matter more than reassurance. Buddy watched the newcomer carefully at first, then settled near him once the tension eased. More followed, one at a time. a former mechanic with a bad knee, a medic who couldn't stand crowds anymore. They didn't share stories unless they wanted to. They ate together in silence or not at all. The mansion adapted. Fires burned longer. Rooms that had been empty gained signs of life. Boots by doors, coats draped over chairs. The house no longer held its breath. Mike noticed the change in himself before he saw it in the walls. He slept longer, not deeply, but without the constant edge of flight. He spoke when spoken to. He stopped counting the days until he might have to leave. Buddy moved through the house with an ease that mirrored Mike's own. His vigilance softened, but never gone. The mansion hadn't been redeemed. It hadn't been transformed into something beautiful. But it had shifted. What once hid crime now held people who needed shelter. What once silenced truth now offered a place where no one was required to explain themselves. Mike stood one evening in the entryway, listening to quiet conversation drift from another room, and understood that ownership wasn't about papers or walls. It was about what you allowed to happen inside. Years passed without announcement. The mansion did not change much from the outside. Its stone walls remained weathered, the roof imperfect, the gates still bent from age. But the cold that once lived inside it no longer ruled the rooms. Fires burned when they were needed. Windows stayed sealed through winter. Voices came and went, leaving behind the faint imprint of lives that had paused there before moving on. Mike stayed. Buddy stayed. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Mike aged in small, honest ways. His beard went fully gray. His hands stiffened in the mornings, and his movements slowed without losing purpose. He no longer flinched at every sound, though he still noticed them. The hypervigilance never vanished completely. It softened, reshaped into awareness rather than fear. Buddy changed too. The German shepherd's muzzle widened. His pace grew measured, but his presence remained steady. He no longer patrolled the grounds endlessly. He watched from the porch, content to observe rather than anticipate. People continued to pass through the mansion, fewer now, but still enough to keep its purpose alive. Some stayed for weeks, some only for a night. They arrived carrying exhaustion more than luggage, and left with lighter steps than when they came. Mike never asked questions unless asked first. He had learned that safety often came from silence and choice. Meals were shared when people wanted company, and taken alone when they didn't. The house adapted to the rhythm of departure without resentment. One late afternoon, Mike sat on the front steps while Buddy rested beside him, his head heavy against Mike's leg. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was quiet, not empty, but settled. Mike watched the light move across the cracked stone and felt something loosen inside his chest. He realized he had not come here to escape his life. He had come here because he needed a place that did not demand more strength than he had left to give. The mansion, scarred and imperfect, had accepted him without conditions. It did not ask him to be healed, productive, or forgiven. It simply stood, holding space. Mike understood then that the house mirrored him. It carried its past openly, neither denying nor glorifying it. It remained standing not because it was restored, but because it was allowed to be what it was. Mike thought of his father, not with anger this time, but with clarity. The past could not be rewritten. Some choices echoed longer than others, but the cycle that had shaped his own life ended here. Not with confrontation or revelation, but with quiet refusal. He would not pass the weight forward. He would not disappear and leave questions unanswered. He stayed. Buddy shifted beside him, letting out a slow breath. Mike rested a hand on the dog's broad shoulder, feeling the familiar warmth beneath thinning fur. The fear that had followed him for years did not vanish in that moment. It simply lost its authority. Mike no longer measured his days by what he was running from, but by what he allowed to remain. As the light faded, Mike stood and opened the door, letting Buddy go in first. The house creaked softly, not in warning, but acknowledgement. This was not a redemption story. It was something quieter and more durable. A place where broken things were not hidden or erased, just given room to exist. For Mike, that was enough. It always had been.
Sometimes the miracle isn't a sudden rescue, but the strength to stay when running feels easier. God doesn't always erase our past. He walks with us through it and reshapes it into purpose. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every quiet battle you face.